and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to this event. Thank you for being here, and I'm delighted that Dun & Bradstreet has the privilege of welcoming you for what we believe is an event around a very foundational technology, and it's a technology that whose implications are still being understood. One of the expressions that are used very often and that we as Dun & Bradstreet prefer to refer to as is, as I said, foundational technology. It is a much more thoughtful and appropriate expression than some of the other expressions that are used, like disruptive technologies, or even the more overused expressions like game changers and paradigm changers and so on and so forth. Foundational technologies are all, along with disruptive technologies and others, are all they all refer to structural and fundamental changes in the industry. However, foundational technologies they follow a very well-known evolutionary path, and the best way to describe that is to use the internet as an example. The evolutionary path that the internet has followed is well illustrated by a set of use cases that over the last 15 years or so we've begun to become very familiar with. And the blockchain technology is going to also follow a similar path as a foundational technology. So take a look at what we have on the screen. The evolutionary path that is followed was in our minds first quoted by the Harvard Business Review. As Dun & Bradstreet, we've done our own research around that model, and what we find is that this really accurately depicts the flight path that evolutionary technologies like the blockchain will follow as well. So what you see on the screen is basically a 2x2 matrix. As you go left to right, what you find is the extent to which applications are new versus established. So as you're on the left side of the screen, these are existing needs of the market met through existing products. As you go right, you have newer needs that are being created in the market and are met through newer products and newer services. So that's as you go left to right. On the y-axis, as you go from the lower part of your screen to the upper part of the screen, you go into areas that are describe the degree of coordination, the complexity or coordination that's needed. So at the lower part of the screen, you have relatively low levels of complexity and fewer players who need to coordinate. As you go up on the chart, you have more coordination and more complexity. So at the bottom left of the screen is the most basic use. So it is relatively lower levels of coordination and relatively established needs that are met through products that are well understood. We call it the basic use at the bottom left of your screen. So very simply, in the internet context, you're talking about the email, right? So emails just replace a messaging service that existed before email. If I have to collaborate or if I have to communicate, let's say with Mahua, I could have used the Telegram, or I could have used some simple technology to communicate point to point. The email replaced that, but that was only the first quadrant of the 4 quadrants. And why that's important is that when someone refers to blockchain as being synonymous with Bitcoin, that's like referring to the internet as email. It's only the first quadrant. It's only the simplest use case. As you go right, so the bottom right of your screen, what you see is what we've called the cluster use. Now there, the number of players coordinating remains relatively small, but the underlying need gets enhanced. So this is the equivalent of corporate email. So within a company, internal emails, which also allow you to share documents, is a use case that was developed after the point-to-point email was developed, and it also allowed certain new cases like the one-to-many communication, right? So what was earlier one-to-one then became a one-to-many type of communication. So that's the second quadrant at the bottom right of your screen. At the top left of your screen, you're now continuing an existing need and an existing product, but now you're enhancing the number of players that are involved. So very simply, something like CNET or Amazon, which were one of the first internet-based business models, and if not business models, certainly internet-based use cases that came out, which involved a lot of coordination. So if you look at CNET, the increased coordination is simply the number of players who are providing content, right? Or if you look at Amazon, it's an existing need. People need to buy, people need to sell. The Amazon service allows you to take that online, and there's more coordination involved. There are more people, there are more sellers, and there are more buyers, right? Now, the top right of the screen is basically things that come on board when the remaining quadrants tend to get embedded, and we tend to get very used to them. So if you look at the internet, for example, the journey that involves the internet based on a dial-up connection to being an always-on internet was quite an interesting step forward. From there, we went to what was called the mobile internet. That was yet another step forward. Over the years, it became very normal to refer to or to look at geolocation services. So you saw where you were on the basis of how the BTS network with which your mobile phone communicated, and the satellites knew where you were. So, for example, Google Maps and their predecessors described where you were. With all of that coming together, it needed also another enabler, which was online and mobile payments to start becoming the norm. And that ecosystem created use cases like, for example, Uber, which you take for granted now. But the ability to think of something that is at the top right needs the embeddedness of something that is in all the other quadrants. And actually, someone who can appreciate it will never be able to automatically think about it unless it needs an unusual level of foresight. So what you get is, for example, use cases like a Skype or an Uber, right? That comes as a result of that stage of evolution. So that's the way in which we'd like to describe what we call a foundational technology. Unlike disruptive technologies, which could take an existing need and meet it in an extraordinarily cheap manner or an extraordinarily efficient manner, disruptive technologies could actually be implemented really fast. They could actually replace an existing use case really fast. Foundational technologies take time, and the internet, for example, has taken more than 30 years to come into its own, and there are still use cases being developed, actually in all four quadrants. So if you use that as a mental model, the blockchain technology is a useful way to think about it. So the first quadrant of the blockchain is basically the one that has made it particularly famous, and some would even say notorious, which is Bitcoin. Now there, what you have is the ability to reduce transactional cost, the ability to disintermediate so that you're taking out the actual issuer of a currency, and the ability to provide instant value to a small set of adopters that have decided to use this as a technology. And we are basically referring to something that we may loosely think of as a distributed ledger. The concept is kind of like using a Google Doc within a closed group of people, and there are other really useful analogies to build kind of mental models around that. So that's the first quadrant. As you go to the second quadrant, you come across examples like private online ledgers. So if you are trying to do trade credit or foreign exchange. So for example, NASDAQ and Bank of America have started testing and in some cases applying limited use cases to private online ledgers that are at the bottom right of your screen. It still needs relatively low levels of coordination. There are fewer players involved, but what it allows you to do is those few players can actually use the concept of blockchain for the use cases that we've described. The user base remains restricted, and over time there can be similar such small ecosystems that get created. So it remains at the bottom right of the screen, but the level of investment goes up a little bit. You now go to the top left of your screen, and what you have is technologies like Stellar. So Stellar is a not-for-profit organization that does allow the substitution of several financial processes simultaneously. So it has its own currency, but it also has other assets. It has other currencies, for example, so you can see why the level of coordination goes up, although the underlying need remains the same. So it stays on the left side of the screen. But because the number of currencies and the number of assets goes up, the number of the players with whom you need to coordinate goes up. I understand that one of the currencies, one of the assets they also use as a way to provide value is telephone minutes. So it's not just currency, but it's also assets that are usable by players who have a use for those. So this is not about uniqueness, right? So it is an existing need. It is an existing product, but it is about scalability and an increased amount of coordination. So Stellar as an example for the replacement quadrant. And then finally on the top right of the screen, you have something that's really known as transformational. There are numerous examples of this, but I'll tell you something that I find most compelling. I think a month or a couple of months ago, there was an article that came out, and it was the cover story of in the Prospect magazine. So those of you who are familiar with the Prospect magazine would recall, the cover story basically spoke about smart money. Smart money is another one of those overused expressions. Every wealth manager would like to offer you smart money. But smart money in this context meant a very specific thing. It was money that effectively has a mind of its own. It decides what are the ethical use cases that a set of users decide to put it to. So for example, it is money, but it's smart in the sense that it cannot be deployed for things like terrorism or arms purchase if that is what is decided, and people who would issue it would typically apply a certain kind of ethical boundary conditions to smart money. It also has the ability to reduce in value when it is used for example, tobacco or certain use cases that are not considered ethical or in line with what the issuers have decided. On the other hand, smart money also enhances in value when it is used for donation or CSR or charitable work. So for those of you who haven't read that, that's a really good thought piece. It's not someone just sitting and dreaming it up. It is something that is being tested in concept, but it's a great example of a transformational technology by the blockchain platform. So that's the four quadrants of a transformational technology, and how Bitcoin will follow something like that kind of trajectory. So just to summarize then, transformational technology is the way we look at Bitcoin. I would love to hear the thoughts of my fellow speakers here as well. But transformational technologies are different from disruptive technologies in the sense that they are much more fundamental. They take much more time to come into their own. If you take the example of the internet as a foundational technology, think about how long it has taken to go all 4 quadrants. And it's not as if the 4 quadrants followed a sequential path. You have new disruptive technologies that come in all the 4 quadrants, and there are spectacular failures that happen in all 4 quadrants as well before the real use cases are actually come into their own. In exactly the same way, you'll have blockchain follow that kind of trajectory, with Bitcoin being an example, private online ledgers being an example on the bottom right, Stellar as an example on the top left, and of course smart money and similar use cases at the top right.